Hello all, welcome to the last lecture for DAH 201. I hope that this class has proved instructive for you and that you have found value in the information that has been presented over the course of the semester. Obviously, we've had a lot of disruption with the pandemic, so I hope that you were still able to get useful information and knowledge and learning from the lectures and the discussions and the readings that we've been having since the pandemic stay place, stay at home orders went into effect. So today we're going to talk about a smidge about authenticity and a little bit about methods of display and museum labels, and then raise the question of repatriation, although that will probably be discussed in more detail in our class session on Monday. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. There will be a little bit of overlap between what we discussed in class this past week and what I talk about, but it shouldn't be too much. So let me go ahead and get started. So for those of you who were in class on Monday, you may remember this image. This is the Musée des Quai Branly, and it is a green building, right? It is covered in plants and vines, and it's really neat. It's a really cool idea. It's from 2005, and it has it creates a very specific feel for this building. But that's part of the problem because this building is not only covered in greens on the outside, but if you go inside the building, and this is a little bit harder to see, but hopefully you can kind of see, do you see how there are like these odd light blue, kind of greenish? So what that is that is a cling on the window, and it is designed to look like grass. Okay, so what you need to know about this museum is that it has long been the primitive art museum, and it is arranged so that you feel like you are traveling from one part of the world to another. It actually has not quite tunnels, but very deep walkways, and the walls are kind of made to simulate like a mud brick, and it's very winding. Okay, and then when you do see these artifacts, they are often juxtaposed against these windows that have these clings with grass and plants. Plus, there are the plants coming in onto the window from the building itself. So this is an attempt to create an atmosphere of like being submerged in nature, in the jungle, right? So you can hopefully see pretty quickly that this is a potentially really problematic way of approaching displaying these objects, right? Because something that we've talked about a lot in this class is the idea of African art as being something that is closer to primitive man. It's closer to nature, right? So all of these things, it is speaking to a more primal man inside all of us. That sort of language is used, right? And the fact that you don't need to know how these objects were used, you don't need to know anything about them because it should speak to you on a spiritual level. So something that we discussed in class on Monday was the use of the term magic. So the Musée des Quai Branly has the word magic in a ton of labels. Okay, not every label, but at least 1 in 5 labels has magique in it because it's in French. Okay, so this is an image that I took when we visited, and you can see, right, how isolated these objects are. They are separated out from each other. Notice that they're also recessed, right? They're not brought to the front, and it's very dark, okay? there are these spotlight lightings on each one to kind of highlight them, but they also kind of loom out of the darkness, right? And you can see that there is text here. But again, right, it references Majik quite a lot. Okay, so think about the language that we use to talk about religions that are more um, practiced by more people, religions that we are more used to. Okay, so think about words like miracles, right? Um, Whereas if there was something, a similar occurrence in this religion, for instance, this indigenous religion, it will probably be termed magic rather than a miracle. Okay, so even the language that we use to describe it is really problematic. All right, and that goes into this idea of the other, right? So othering. For those of you who may not be familiar with the term, it is, quote, the reductive action of labeling a man or woman as someone who belongs to a subordinate social category, all right, end quote. So basically, us, them, all right? There is a power imbalance that is inherent in this sort of thing. It places people at the margins of society, okay? And we have long in the West used the idea and the language and the concept of othering to discuss non-Western cultures. And in this way, we actually do preserve dominator and dominated discourse, right? So just the way that this is spoken about sets us up to be at odds. So we can never see them as equals. They are something else. Okay? So that's kind of the idea of othering. Let me see what else. Oh, okay. So here you can see that these objects have been lifted so that they are higher. This is a practice that we saw at the DIA. But the DIA approached it somewhat differently because look at how dark this image is. Okay, look at all the shadow surrounding it and the way that they're kind of lit from below. So I mentioned this in class, but think about like sitting around a campfire, okay, and you've got your flashlight, and you put it under your face so that the light kind of shines up, and you look kind of spooky and eerie, and then you tell ghost stories, right? Like specter face or whatever. That's kind of what you're seeing here, right? This idea of like casting odd shadows, eeriness, spookiness, etc. Okay, so it is a very problematic way of displaying these objects. So I want you to kind of think about what you see when you go to a museum, all right? Think about how these works are displayed. So this is again tying in with the assignment for visiting the DIA, where I had you go in and look at the environment and the labels, etc., etc. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about labels. So first of all, I should say that labels are hard to write, okay? So I believe they say that you have, based on studies of visitors to museums, they say that you have, I think, about 13 seconds of attention if they stop and look at it, and they won't stop and look at everything. So you have 13 seconds in which to convey everything that you can, everything that you need to about these objects. So some rules of thumb that are typically followed are the idea that you should have no more than 50 words per label, and also that you should have no state of being verbs. So no am, is, are, was, were, be, being, been. Okay, so you can see how this is very contrived, and you're trying to get a lot across, and it's something that's very difficult to do. So when labels are missing information, part of that has to do with simply the format in which it's being presented. They have very little time. They're probably working within some constraints. Like what I mentioned, not everything is so contrived, but that was what was told to me in a class that I took on writing labels. Okay, so I want to take a look at a few labels and just kind of talk about that. And then um, we'll touch on authenticity and then we'll call it a semester. So, okay, so think about the labels that you saw at the DIA, all right? So let's take a look at this is not showing what I had hoped. So it is a brass plaque. Okay, so let me just quickly bring up. Okay, so it is a brass plaque similar to this. Okay, so this is what we're talking about. And so you can see that there's a description here. So this is from the BBC. This is from England. And the information is taken from the British Museum of Art. Okay, so the figure at the center of this brass plaque is the oba, okay, etc., etc. It's describing what you see. Okay, Kingdom of Benin that dominated trade with the Europeans. All right, Portuguese traders arrived in Benin in the 1400s. They brought brass bracelets known as manillas to exchange for pepper, ivory, and slaves, etc., etc. When these plaques were first seen in Europe in the late 1890s, they astounded art critics. Okay, so that's just kind of the description of the work. And then this is information from a curator at the British Museum. Okay, so you can see that she's talking about it, where it came from, how it was made, its time period. Okay, all right, so here we go. Um, so it's talking about the Portuguese and trade, okay? Talking about the political system in the Kingdom of Benin, the Oba, okay, etc. So you will rarely see information about the provenance of these pieces, the history of these pieces, how far back it goes. Okay, so let's take a look at a piece that's at the DIA. So this is a plaque from the Kingdom of Benin between 1500 and 1897. Gee, 1897 is awfully specific. So if you think back to our class on the Kingdom of Benin and Nigeria as a whole, you might remember that the punitive expedition of 1897 occurred in 1897. So if you hopefully kind of remember some of this this history, right? So Britain wanted certain trading rights that the Oba, or king of the Kingdom of Benin, did not want to give to them. And so a soldier basically went rogue, and he took a contingent of armed soldiers and mercenaries with him, and they went to the Kingdom of Benin, and the Oba sent someone out who was like, we're super glad you're here. We're actually in the middle of a religious ceremony. You can't witness it. Can you come back later? And the British soldier was like, no. So he starts advancing on the city, and the Oba finds out about the weapons, and he sends out some of his soldiers, and the British soldier who went rogue gets killed. And as punishment, the British expedition of 1897 takes place, which is basically Britain sends soldiers in retaliation or punishment for the killing of this rogue soldiers and some of his band. And they sack the palace, they exile the Oba, they get the trading rights that they wanted, okay? So 1897, very specific date. Okay, so let's see what the DIA has to say on the topic. Okay, so in a culture without written records, blah, 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 mudfish, Benin tradition, paralyzed, mudfish, 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 okay. Um, oh, there's nothing about why that specific date, how this came into being. Okay, well, all right, so let's think about what I just said about labels, right? You only have 13 seconds, you have to try to convey something important, etc. But this is a website, and the website lists the provenance. So if you remember, we've talked about provenance in class before, and this is the history of who has owned the piece previously. Provenance is really important because A, it shows that the work is authentic. B, it can really increase the value if somebody famous or particularly wealthy, etc., owned the object. It will be exponentially more valuable than the exact same thing that was owned by a common whomever. And C, it's really important in terms of making sure that objects were acquired ethically. Okay, so there's a huge black market trade in objects from Egypt and Greece, Italy, right? So think about like all the culture that is there, and these objects are stolen and sold. So provenance helps establish that this was not looted before the laws went into place saying that you can't purchase looted artwork. So 1971, there was a UNESCO uh, declaration in 1971. Okay, so we have the provenance listed. Fab, this will tell us more. Cranbrook Academy, 1938. 1972, there's nothing here, okay? So obviously this existed before 1938, right? So this is something that you will see again and again. It is not common to see the provenance referencing the how these objects were actually acquired. Okay, look at this. Until 1898. Okay, that's a lot better. So it goes much farther back, right? But it doesn't say how Norman Burroughs acquired it, right? So that's a bit of a mystery, okay? So one thing that I want to show you is that there has been advancement towards including this information more, okay? So we're going to take a look at this tusk, which is in the Indianapolis Museum of Art. And this is one of the best labels that I have ever seen in terms of including information about its provenance in the actual label, not just in the provenance section, and making it clear that it's problematic. Okay, so what you need to observe about this is that it's darker at the top. Okay, that becomes relevant in this label. Okay, so figured elephant tusks, placed in palace complex, blah, blah, blah. Prominent figure of the Oba, blah, blah, blah. The last sentence here that we're looking at. The charred surface, particularly at the top of this tusk, may have resulted from fire damage during the 1897 British military expedition to Benin City. Okay, so that doesn't exactly tell us what happened, but it gets a heck of a lot closer. All right, but then even the provenance doesn't tell us anything. Okay, so just something to think about. Do you think that museums should be incorporating information about how these works were acquired in their labels? If you have 13 seconds and about 15 words, 50 words to communicate with someone who's looking at the art, do you think that talking about how these objects were acquired should be part of that? Or is it more important to talk about the role that these played in society, right? So the fact that, you know, each oboe would have their own, they would be placed on altars, okay? So it's a delicate balance, but I want you to think about this, okay? Really think about it. And then lastly, I want to show you the British Museum. Okay, so the British Museum has one of these plaques. Well, they have a lot of these plaques. A large proportion of them ended up in the British Museum. Okay, but we're looking at this specific one. Okay, so the curator's comments used to decorate the king's palace, etc. Okay, in the years prior to the British expedition, royal influence in Benin was increasingly under threat, etc., etc. Okay, so that's it. That's something in the years prior to the British expedition. Notice, though, that it's called the British expedition. There's no punitive, nothing like that. All right, this was also written in 1973. So it's a good label in terms of providing information about how these would have been seen in their culture of origin, but it's old and it doesn't explain what the British expedition is. Why is that even relevant, right? If you don't know anything about the British expedition, that means nothing to you. It doesn't say that that is how these plaques were acquired. There's none of that, right? But, and this is what I want you to see, the acquisition notes are written much more recently, okay? Following the British occupation of Benin City in 1897, objects made of brass, ivory, and wood were seized by the British force from the royal quarters and various storerooms, right? So then it continues to talk about how the British Museum successfully petitioned the government to safeguard some of the objects. Over 300 brass plaques were sent to the UK. Okay, so then it talks about during the summer of 1897, British Museum temporarily loaned some of these plaques. Okay, so then it talks a little bit more about how these plaques were sent out. And today, over 900 plaques are known to exist in museums and private collections around the world. Okay, so this is surprisingly transparent in terms of the provenance, and admittedly, this is the British Museum. Okay, so they have been in possession of this plaque since it was taken from the Kingdom of Benin in 1897. That is not the case for something like the DIA plaque here, right, which we saw was sold in 1938. Okay, and we have no information prior to that. It's possible that there does not exist the information of how Cranbrook Academy of Art got it, etc. Okay, so we're dealing with a lot of factors here, and that's something that I want you to keep in mind. But just kind of interesting about labels. So there's one other thing that I want to point out to you about displays. Okay, so we looked at the Musée de Quai Branly, which is an art museum. Okay, so the objects, like we saw in the DIA, tend to be isolated. They're presented for their formal and aesthetic qualities. The emphasis here is not on promoting a greater understanding of the culture as a whole. It is on these objects, their formal, beautiful qualities, and then some history provided about them. All right, so this is the Field Museum in Chicago. The Field Museum is a natural history museum, and you'll see that the way that these objects are displayed is very different, okay? Look at the lighting. It's all pretty even. There are none of these spotlights. The objects are much more grouped together. You can see that there is some context provided. So here you have an image of an oba holding a ceremonial sword and dressed in coral regalia. You see something similar here. You see chiefs in the oba wearing coral regalia. Okay, you see the tusk, you see the head. So these objects are all the same objects across museums, but it changes. Okay, also at the Field Museum, they have a recreation of an altar. So the image in the background was taken in, I believe, the 1970s, and it was a recreated altar for an oba in the Kingdom of Benin. So this had been put together by the people, the culture of origin. Okay, and you can see that there is an attempt to do something similar here at the Field Museum. There's a lot of information. The white strip in the front is also written material. Okay, so again, think about the difference between that and art museums, the way that these objects are completely isolated from their the various things that would have been kept with them. Okay, so although these objects are not individually isolated, like in nice clean boxes, when I say isolated, I mean from anything that would tell about their history, right? There's one other thing that I want to show you, and I do not have an image in Luna. So let me show you the Pitt Rivers Museum. So the Pitt Rivers Museum is fascinating. It is a museum in Oxford, and it is massively overwhelming. So it displays all of these objects, but it displays them the way that they were seen in the 19th century. So museums have a history of coming from cabinets of curiosities, and I believe we've talked about this in class. So anything that was deemed a curiosity would have been gathered into these massive collections, okay? And people would have gone in and viewed what these objects looked like without any contextualizing information. The Pitt Rivers is unique in that it has retained the setup of the museum from the 19th century, okay? And there is text when you walk into the museum explaining that this is never, you would never see this in a museum that was set up today, but it's being presented as examples of these types of objects and art, as well as an example of how 19th century people would have looked at these objects. Okay, so you can see that it is a tall building and there are lots of cases. There's a lot here, kind of narrow pathways. All right, so look how narrow this is, right? So she's pretty close. Look at what is in here. Okay, so here we have Asian ceramics. We have skulls, treatment of dead enemies. So this is not a contemporary label. This is what would have been applied at the time that these objects were collected. Okay, um, it's just overwhelming. So think about all the cultures that are just smashed in here, and there's no information providing mediation. There's you have totem poles on top of Maori shrunken heads, next to Egyptian mummies, next to Asian ceramics, next to Native American baskets. It's overwhelming, okay? And this is how people have traditionally seen these objects, okay? So we have come a very long way, and you can kind of see how the isolated aesthetic of the art museum would perhaps be very appealing coming from a setup like this, okay? So there's a really long and interesting history of museums, and there's a lot that museums are dealing with. There's also a lot of pushback against change within museums. So museums tend to be rather conservative places, but they also are working with donors. And the donors are the collectors that we've seen in the movies, in the readings that we've done, etc. Right? These same people who don't want to go to Africa because they like to lie on their couch and have their wife stroke their brow and eat grapes and think about, the magical environment that these things came from. Okay? Someone who collects these objects and thinks in this way is perhaps not going to want to donate objects to your museum If you present them and you are very blunt and you say how these would have been acquired, why it's problematic, etc. All right, so there are a lot of forces at work here. But again, I just want you to engage in this type of critical thinking the next time that you go into a museum and see various things, various ways of displaying the information that is or is not included, etc. So the reading that was assigned for this week has to do with reinstallation of African galleries in 4 different museums and the various ways that they have approached it. Okay, so if you have not yet done the reading, um, really pay attention to where the author, Ruth B. Phillips, talks about multivocality. Okay, so multiple voices, right? So think about if you were installing a museum, if you were installing an exhibit, who would you consult? Would you consult academia only? Right? So people who have spent their whole lives studying these objects. Would you consult the people who made these objects, even though there's a distance of perhaps 100, 200 years between the life of the creator and people who are living now, all right? So I just want you to think about these things, okay? And also think about, where do you stand on the topic of repatriation? All right, so we've talked about repatriation a bit over the course of the semester, but the semester is now almost over, and I'm curious what you think, if your thinking has changed at all about repatriation, and what you think of the way that these objects are displayed in museums, right? So we are massively privileged that before shelter in place, we could just walk out of school and go into the DIA and see these objects that we talked about in person, right? It really, really makes the subject matter much more real to be able to see it in person. But at what point is the knowledge that viewers gain or even researchers gain not enough to justify taking these objects, right? So, and I talked in class a little bit about the Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act, so NAGPRA, and it's exactly what it sounds like. But again, right, as we've talked about elsewhere in class, it's the privileging of textual cultures over oral cultures, so it still has a lot of problems. But one thing that has been instituted is, if there is new building, etc., on land and they recover human remains, there are some agreements that can be put into place that allow researchers to study the human remains for a set period of time. They may not display them. And then at the end of that period, they are returned to the culture of origin, and the remains are buried, um, however that culture treats their ancestors, the remains of their ancestors. So that's one example of how it could be handled. But again, that's for human remains and grave goods specifically. All right. So these are all things that I want you to think about. Hopefully, this has been a fruitful class for you. And I hope that it has also encouraged you to really look critically at not just African art and how it's displayed, but just kind of think about, I want to say everything, but you'll laugh at me, but just take the skills that hopefully you've kind of developed and honed a bit in this class and apply it to things like information, right? Think about, does this make sense, what I'm being told by the president or by the media, etc. So hopefully you have gained knowledge, you have gained some direction in how to approach thinking critically. I have really enjoyed having you in my class. I'm sorry that we couldn't do more in person, but I'm very impressed with how well all of you have dealt with the really crappy hand of cards everybody has this semester. So thank you so much, and I will hope to see you in the library. And please feel free to contact me if you ever have questions or if you want help on a research project, etc. All right, see y'all.